let's dive into the topic at hand. And I want to give you the opportunity kind of to say, what do you see in the Latino communities as of right now? I know you talked a little bit about, the some things regarding how they kind of perceive the American dream and some potential hurdles in comparison to other demographics, of course. But as of right now, when you see the Latino community very broadly, what do you see? What do you see them as right now? And what are potentially hopes that you can think that can be better for them moving forward? So I'll be curious to
Sure.
see your opinion regarding that.
So there was a study that came out just a few months ago. It's called the Latino GDP report. And if you haven't taken a chance, if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, I highly recommend it. It's out there. You can download it. There's a lot of interesting results in it, but the biggest result, like the big sort of top level result, is basically that if you took the Latino economy within the United States and made it its own country, it would be the fourth largest economy in the world. Massive, massive amount of money that's going through the Latino community. That said, once you the next sort of logical step that goes from that is Latinos must be super well off. And then you realize, but wait, hold on, that's not quite the case. There are Latinos who are well off, but I don't think anybody would say, wow, the Latino community is looking, doing amazing necessarily. And so once you start taking that large number, which is about, I think, $3.2 trillion, and you divide it in sort of the per capita, you see that's when the numbers sort of come out. And so you realize that that sort of goes back to some of those income and wealth numbers that I was talking about earlier, right? That basically for the amount of Latinos that are out there in the United States, even though the total GDP of Latinos is a huge number, it's still a huge gap to what it should be in terms of making it, if we had anything resembling parity, which I'm not saying that it should be that way, but it's just sort of a benchmark, a way to measure it, right? So there's that piece, right? So that's a huge amount of money. You see so much marketing nowadays being aimed at the Latino community because it's just good business. There's 60 million Latinos out there. There is money there. They're spending. They're not saving their money because they don't have. They're not at that point, so they're spending their money, and so there's so much marketing that's being directed at Latinos. So much messaging about what you should have and what you should buy, and that sort of thing. So that's one side. The other side is that what you need to understand about Latinos, and this is something that I think my experience has been different with the African American community. And let me get back to that for a second. Latinos, when they come to the United States, don't call themselves Latinos, right? My mom doesn't say she's Latina. My mom says she's Mexican. My dad says he's Salvadoran. My wife says she's Nicaraguan. Latin America is a huge continent. What we have in common is a base language. But if you ever heard a Dominican speak and an Argentinian speak, it's like they're speaking from two different planets. They're speaking the same language, but it doesn't at all sound the same. The grammar's not the same. The slang is not the same. The music isn't the same. The food isn't the same. Possibly the religion isn't even the same, even though historically Catholicism has been a big part of the Latin American community. I would say that's less and less now. So there's a lot of cultural, linguistic, social sort of things that are extremely different all through Latin America. And so then you come to the United States and suddenly you're expected to be a sort of monolithic group. You are all Latinos now. You're not Mexican, you're not Cuban, you're not Nicaraguan, you're not Puerto Rican. You are all Latinos now. And that is really tough because it's different countries, it's different cultures. People come with their preconceived notions about other types of Latinos within Latin America, and then suddenly you're in the United States and you're expected to be part of that group, and you're expected to cooperate, and you're expected to you're told that, you know, you are all part of the same group and you need to lift each other up. And so there's a lot of talk about that, but I don't think Latinos do nearly a good enough job at behaving as a sort of group, as we're called. You know, that there's not really a good unified Latino front. And so what I was going back to earlier, that's not something that I see so much within the African American community. I feel like the African American community has a much deeper internalized understanding of their commonality as African Americans. And I think there's my experience has been that African Americans are actually much more willing to uplift not only each other, but I have to say, and it's really, and I've talked to lots of other successful Latinos who would say the same thing, that their biggest mentors, their biggest cheerleaders, the people who have pushed them, advanced them, the people who have picked up the phone for them and said, I vouch for this person, have been African Americans supporting the Latino community. And I also think that's not something that nearly gets talked about enough. So, you know, I find it fascinating. There are so many Latinos out there, so many, frankly, very successful Latinos out there, but the ones that are helping us and really pushing us to want to get ahead are our African American brothers and sisters. And so that's something that I'm always sure to say, because it's been really important, and I think something that we as Latinos need to emulate more. We need to sort of be on that track of really uplifting each other. And part of that comes back to that idea of accepting that we're in the United States. You know, we're not in our home countries anymore. We can celebrate our own cultures and our version of the language and the food, but that we also have to acknowledge that we're Latinos. This is how we are seen here, and that the more we can come together as a unified front, the better that we are able to advocate for, frankly, the common struggles that we have. And you know, that's a big part of where I come from. If you've ever seen, you know, the actor John Leguizamo, he's a great actor. He's a comedian, the whole thing. But he's been very, very active, I would say, in the last couple of years, really advocating for Latinos. And I actually had the chance to see him speak just a few months ago at a big conference in Miami. And he did something that I have never seen another Latino do, which is that he went for about 5 minutes talking about how much he loves, you know, Venezuelan food and Dominican Spanish and Argentinian music and tango. And he basically had this whole amazing love fest for Latinos and the Latino community. And he went so far out of his way to basically kind of echo the message that I'm saying here, that's great. You bring all of that, and the more that you bring, the stronger that Latino community is in the United States, and the more that you celebrate all of that, the stronger that you are as an individual, because you accept and take pride in your culture and your version of it, to the point where you can appreciate everyone else's. I found it really fascinating that in his talk, at no point did he say where he was from. And that was, I think, to me, that was really important, that it was all about, he identifies as a Latino. He talks about all of us being Latinos, and that we all bring that strength together, that we all need to uplift each other that way. It was a version of that message that I had never heard on that kind of level before, and which I really, really appreciated that from him. And that's what I would like to see more of, you know, that the Latino community coming together in commonality, uplifting each other, and creating not just that pipeline, but creating pipelines that don't exist yet, you know.
I definitely hear what you're saying when it comes down to Latino community coming together, because from my perspective, I would probably agree that I don't really see a solid solidified front from all Latinos across America, especially compared to the Black community. I mean, we have a lot of movements in the Black community that are very powerful and very loud. Um, the thing I will say though, I guess the biggest difference is obviously black people have a more embedded stake in what the United States is and the history of the United States, because there is somewhat of a difference, and sometimes they integrate very well. But there is somewhat of a difference between a black American versus an immigrant from a different country, maybe from Africa or from South America, of course. And there is some disconnect between the two groups, especially groups that come in more wealthier than and more wealthy than other individuals. But overall, even though that does happen sometimes, because I've heard people from Nigeria, for example, or someone from Jamaica, for example, kind of say that they are distinctly different from black people, black Americans. They still identify as black American at the end of the day, even though they keep hold of their culture. So I definitely hear what you're saying regarding that. And a solidified front is always good because we always want to make sure that we're pushing the status quo. We're making sure that everybody's improving on every front, from especially from the marginalized communities, so everyone can continue to prosper, and we don't let certain groups, mostly kind of my viewpoint. I don't tech For me personally, I don't really see it as a kind of a race versus race situation. I see it as the kind of basically disappearing middle class and the lower income and the very, 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 very rich people and what they're doing over there. So constantly putting pressure on them is good. With that said, in addition to solidifying the Latino community and obviously pushing different aspects of like Latino culture, you did mention that there's a lot more kind of individuality between the Latino community with all the different countries that you're referring to, the different types of slang, maybe dialect, and even religion. Do you think the solidification of the Latino community would take away from that certain level of individuality of all these groups? And do you think that this is something that people want necessarily? Uh, because even though, and I'm gonna let you answer this question, even though for the most part I'd say the Latino community is on the left, there is a growing sense of Latino communities moving towards the right as well. So there is definitely a big expression on their individuality based off their own culture and stuff that you're referring to. So do you think this is in the best interest in the Latino community as a whole with all these individual differences that you're referring to?
Sure. So by I've mentioned I'm an economist. I am specifically a microeconomist, which means that I place a tremendous amount of worth and value and importance on the individual and the choices that the individual makes and the way the individual goes about making choices. And so some of what I talked about earlier in terms of the American dream and this sort of thing, this shining thing on the hill that people are chasing, and how that is damaging a lot of our culture, I think, is because it is forcing a an optimization problem that is not necessarily the right one for each individual. Okay, so for me, maximizing that individuality, meaning creating the opportunity for each person to think about their purpose in life. Why am I here? What are the strengths that I bring? What are the unique problem solving approaches to problems that I bring? Creating in individuals and in families and in communities the methods, the approaches, the openness for each person to take that sort of core, that inner purpose, and align their actions, align their lives to it, such that the person is living authentically. And I think at the end of the day, that lack of authenticity is the problem for me with so much of what we talk about in terms of the American dream. So creating that space where people are able to be authentic and in that sense individual, whether it's with what they choose to pursue in terms of careers, lifestyle, and the cultures that they choose to adopt. So included in that is how strong do they want to be affiliated with their sort of country of origin, and how much pride they express in that. All of that is something that people need to have the space in which to behave authentically about, and not be told that, if you're doing so. For example, I will give you an example. My wife, who's my partner in our business, she's the primary author of our book, Creating Your Limitless Life, that we've just published. She has a PhD in environmental science. And she will tell you that as she was pursuing her degree, the most common messaging that she heard from her fellow Latinos and Latinas was that environmental science is for white people. And that was the messaging that she got, right? We as Latinos don't do that. You must somehow be less Latino if that's what you're doing, right? When the truth is, for one, a big part of what she talked about was looking at, for example, how it is that in things bordering on environmental justice, and looking at how different types of polluting activities most strongly affect immigrant, Black, Brown, Latino communities in the United States, right? So part of that is actually understanding how it is that our communities are affected by a lot of these things. So if anything, we should be the ones who care the most about it. But there's that perspective, right? That there are things that we as Latinos do and we as Latinos don't do. And we need to have, that's a big part of the discourse that needs to change, that we support this idea that people have an authenticity, that people have an individuality that they need, that they should be able to express, align their lives with in so many ways. And to me, that creation of that space for that individuality is specifically what creates a stronger community. Because when you have that support from your community, when you have that support from your family, so much of what we see now, Esther and I, my wife and I, we speak a lot, for example, at colleges and universities, specifically to Black and Latino students. And we hear so often from Latino students that in order for them to go to college, in order for them to pursue what they want to pursue, that they literally have to break away from their families, that their families have other expectations for them, that their families tell them that this is not for you, this is not what Latinos do. And they have to make the choice of, do I follow what I want to do, or do I listen to what my family says? And so for them to make that choice is something emotionally painful. It causes them a lot of pain, to not be able to feel like they have the space to express that authenticity in themselves. So I think, that's a big piece of it, creating those spaces within our communities where we allow people to be authentic, pursue their purpose, align their actions to it, and that is what's going to help make our community stronger. Something that's going to help us, the young people, want to stay in the communities, to want to actually be part of the communities, to integrate into them, to make them stronger. And that at the end of the day, to me, that is something that will not only transcend, but actually help us see as a strength and a benefit. For example, the cultural differences that we see across Colombians, Dominicans, Mexicans, Nicaraguans, Hondurans, that, if I am so sufficiently secure in my identity as a Mexican Salvadoran born in the United States, that I can appreciate all of that, that then I also can see someone else from a totally different part of Latin America, see them as my brother and sister, and want to uplift them and see them as part of my community as well.
So when it comes down to it, although I think that the communities at large, the marginalized communities, like the poor communities, the in general, should always come together to make sure their community is better, because it's going to take the people to make the community better. There is absolutely nothing wrong for resources based off a certain type of experience that everybody that is a part of that group can kind of uh, they can kind of connect with, basically. So a resource for the Latino community to allow them to be their authentic self, as you said, and potentially go down the road of opportunity in a more efficient manner is very understandable. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it, from my opinion, of course. So with that said, when you have that resource available for this community, that obviously if you're Latino, if you're, Hispanic in any sort of way, this is a way for you to kind of use this resource to achieve the American dream that everybody's talking about. And the goal, from basically what it sounds like, is to ensure that yes, hard work potentially gives you the opportunity to get the career or fulfill that dream that you're having. Well, we want to have the ability to ensure that where you start from the path of that you're about to walk is as close as everybody else's as possible. So to ensure that the starting point, because that's the big thing. Yes, the opportunity there, but the biggest thing when it comes to these conversations is the starting point. To ensure the starting point is equal, or I would dare say even greater to some other groups as well. How would you ensure that that starting point is better for the Latino community moving forward?
Okay, so a couple things. Um, from from a particular point of view, one of the things that really holds back growth, and this is sort of almost macroeconomics 101, but one of the biggest things that constrains growth is access to credit. And we see that everywhere. I've worked with farmers all over the world, and they talk about, I need more credit because I have a gap between my sowing season and my harvesting season, and I need some credit to get me through. Or I need, you talk to fishermen in Ghana, and they'll tell you, you know what, I could do so much better if I had a second boat, but I don't have the cash and I can't get the credit, right? So there's credit constraining growth, or lack of access to credit. And that's definitely something that I see, uh, certainly not only in the Latino communities, but in the African American communities and in Native American communities in the United States, as well as that unwillingness of lenders to take a chance on these folks. And so that's something that really puts people behind in terms of how it is that they're going to go about um, investing, in a sense. Immigrants in the United States are the most likely group to start their own business because that's how people see that opportunity. In the face of unequal opportunity and discrimination, the best thing that I can do is sort of strike off on my own. Um, and credit access to just operational credit is one of the things that really constrains new businesses. And so, as much as, for example, Latinos and African Americans are most likely to start new businesses, they're also the most likely to fail because they're not able to grow in that way. So one would be to, find ways to improve access to productive uses of credit that Latinos and immigrants may have access to as they come to the United States. That's one piece. The second piece is that I think that there is a tremendous amount of value in sort of community level organizations. And so I'm going to tell you specifically what I think about here. So one of the biggest things that really boosts someone's potential earning capacity is how they build up their human capital, right? And human capital, the easiest way to think about it is education. It's a lot more complex than that, but that's the easiest way to think about it, right? When I was a professor, in a heavily Latino community, and we would go to high schools and basically give motivational speeches to the students, to the teachers, to the administration, to their parents. Um, and a lot of the times we saw that the students themselves had a vision. They wanted to go to college. They had something in mind that they wanted to do. But it was really hard to talk to the parents. And the parents would often give me the messaging along the lines of what I was talking about earlier of, they would call me teacher, teacher, maestro, that sounds great and all, but that's not really for people like us. Right. That's such a heartbreaking thing all the time for me to hear, because I come from immigrant family. I know what that space looks like. And when they say people like us, to me, people like us is people who work their asses off, people who took massive risks to leave the comfort of the situation of their home countries to come to a place where they knew nobody, who didn't speak the language necessarily, so they're risk takers, they're entrepreneurs, they're hardworking. So, if opportunity isn't for those people, for who is it? So I think there's a tremendous amount of value in having community-based organizations that specifically are about strategizing how it is that we message within our families and within our communities to create those opportunities, and to understand that this is a long-term game. It's the sort of thing that, yes, I'm going to be in school for several years, but this is what that opportunity is going to do for me, for us, for our family, for our community, for my future. This is why you came, right? You came to give us opportunities. Let's exploit those opportunities to the fullest. Let's maximize our chances of really making it. And so I think that those conversations need to happen. I don't think enough of those conversations are happening within Latino communities, within Latino households, about what it is that we need to do strategically, really rationally, to build up our own opportunity, our own potential, take advantage of what's there, and really maximize it to the greatest extent possible.
Those are definitely interesting solutions that you're referring to. Because I do think that obviously the reference to credit is huge, and that just like you said plays into economics, it plays into business. Because at the end of the day, how many people are just going to have the money up front to do some of the bigger visions that they have in for or they have for themselves, of course. So that's definitely common sense, and it makes sense of to as a resource at the very least. In terms of the second thing you're referring to, that definitely is a step in kind of changing mindset, changing culture
Yeah.
to allow people to kind of extend beyond what they think is okay for them. And there's nothing wrong with it because like you said, that abides to the American dream, of course. So those are very interesting things and aspects. But when it comes to changing the mindset, changing the culture, and building this community that you're referring to, some of the things that you reference is something much more individualized for the people, and that's mental health, and something that I saw you reference at some point as well is kind of the culture of masculinity, the culture of the values that they instill, bringing from wherever they brought it from and trying to plant it here, of course. So not only will you try to change the outlook of what it means to be a successful Latino, well, you're gonna have to change the what it means to be basically Latino in itself right now, and that's gonna be a big culture change. How would you go about doing that and engaging in these conversations to potentially bring a healthier and more optimistic than it already is, and open-minded mindset for the Latino community?
I think that is a huge piece. It's something that I'm really glad you brought it up, because it's something that I feel really, really passionate about in terms of redefining masculinity in terms of the Latino community, which means really, at the end of the day, redefining how it is that Latinos see their roles within their families and their communities. The it's a joke. It's funny. You see so much. If you look at anything Latino on Instagram or TikTok, um, there's so many things about that come down to machismo, how it is that men should act. This interesting stoicism that we're expected to have, where anything that shows vulnerability is necessarily a weakness, and there's nothing worse in machismo than appearing weak. Um, and I think that is, when we think it's beyond toxic. It's something that infiltrates our minds, and the ways in which we talk to each other, the way in which men talk to and talk about women. It's 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 more than toxic. It's a burden that we end up carrying. Um, I think that so much of machismo is show. that so many Latino men actually want to express their feelings and want to talk about the things that worry them and bother them and the things that they're afraid of, and our culture doesn't necessarily have a lot of avenues for men to do that. um, and which means that it's more than just men, because women reinforce it too, right? So we're sort of all bought into this cultural paradigm, and it's something that really needs to change. And you asked me about how, and my solution has been basically this: like, this conversation that we're having is part of my how, and talking about it and calling it out and telling people that you can do better, you know. That's a piece of it, and it's me getting on any stage that I can and talking about that. When I talk to the thousands of university students that I've talked to, I have that conversation. When I talk to anybody in my circle, I have that conversation, because it's really important for men to understand that, in fact, seeing vulnerability as weakness is actually fundamentally wrong, right? The word vulnerable means that you are open to harm, right? That's literally the root of the meaning of the word. It means that you're open to harm. To me, knowingly putting yourself out there and making yourself vulnerable is the ultimate expression of strength. I'm so I feel so strong. I feel so confident in my position, in what I do, that I am willing to show you my vulnerability, and that is true strength. So for me, a big piece of redefining that Latino masculinity is really having that expression of vulnerability as strength be part of the core principle of it, and then talking about it, talking about it as much as you can. I talk to my wife all the time about the things that I worry about and the things that I'm afraid of, and the things that I think about and the things I dream about, and really starting to create those circles for myself where um, that's the sort of conversations that we have. We get away from, and if any of your listeners are Latinos, one of the big things that we hear in our families is a lot of what's called chisme culture. And chisme is basically gossip. That, instead of that a favorite pastime is basically to gossip about other family members and people that you know on the street and people that you know in common, and really trying to change that conversation to, what, that's really unproductive conversation, and starting to have those conversations instead about ideas, and start talking about, ways that we can propel ourselves forward, and things that are much more genuine and authentic than just gossiping about others. But the how, at the end of the day, requires the individual to take responsibility, to see, to visualize a better outcome, and to take steps to actually make that happen. And it requires a certain amount of strength, because it's going to mean arguing with your family sometimes. And we've had several arguments within our family about, why are you talking about that, and why are you saying that, and that's not appropriate for a Latino, and that's not appropriate for a man to to say and to talk that way. And the reality is that, as I said, we have to do something different, because we see this crisis of identity in the Latino community. We see this crisis of mental health in the Latino community. And we can do so much better, I think, just by really having these open, authentic conversations that are not always easy. I'm not saying it's easy, and sometimes it's going to be ugly, but that the possibilities for a better outcome absolutely warrant those conversations, I would say. And thinking about our conversation as we started out, I think that's true not just in the Latino community. I think that's something at a national level, that really would benefit this country, this opportunity to have these open conversations. I'm not saying they're going to be easy. I'm not saying they're going to be pretty, but if you go into them with an open mind, and looking for common ground instead of looking for ways to divide, I think that the potential for a positive, stronger outcome is absolutely worth the conversation.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I wholeheartedly agree to the sentiment that this kind of applies wider than even the Latino community.
Yeah.
It's it's definitely flawed thinking that you got to be this kind of stoic individual that stays in your lane, of course, because at the end of the day, every innovation that we've seen basically required some level of vulnerability to get out there to kind of change what is current society. In order to progress, you have to do things that is against the status quo in the first place, as we've know. Bill Gates did something that nobody expected and created Microsoft. When it comes down to the sports, Jackie Robinson did something unexpected by joining the MLB, being the first African American baseball player, and that's kind of set a tone in terms of sports. So there's time and time again, there's things that are currently existing in society that, for the most part, in order to reach its current state of being, it required a certain level of risk and vulnerability to gain that, or to enter that level of success in the first place. So I agree it's flawed, and the conversations that you need to have are extremely important, extremely valuable. Just having questions, just kind of bouncing off ideas, to learning about different perspectives. At that moment, you start entering a level of thinking about not only yourself, your community, your people, but the society as a whole, and thinking about ways to improve society, because ultimately the betterment of communities, the better of you as an individual and your people, for the most part, unless you're some crazy psychopath that wants to destroy America, is in the betterment of America as a whole. That's the whole thing. That's kind of the mindset of even capitalism. Like, everybody succeeds if your community succeeds, for the most part. With that said, the conversations are important. Making sure they have the proper resources and tools are important. But something that should always be mentioned in these conversations is not only appealing to the groups that you're currently in, because this all sounds good for the Latino community, as you said. And as you have these conversations, you'll convince people and get people on board, of course. But there's other outside external factors you have to consider in terms of pushing this solution forward. And one big thing that people in marginalized communities always have to consider is that, okay, whether you guys agree with it or not, but what about the majority population? The white people, right? The white individuals that exist, and not the rich people, because those people have a very, very specific mindset, but the other poor white people, middle class white people that are not inherently benefiting from, your non-success, but are living their own lives and have no interest in getting themselves involved with anybody else if it doesn't interest their own well-being and what they're going through and what struggles they're going to, of course. So when it comes down to it, specifically like the poorer white communities, because obviously they're what Latino communities doing for them and the resources that they're implementing, or for their people, of course. But you can understand why someone from the white community that is in the poor end, that doesn't have the same resources or conversation that's going on, doesn't see why they should support it, even though they're the majority population when it comes to the poor white people, of course. How do you appeal to these people? Because expecting them to just morally get on your side is unrealistic. A lot of that, you can find a lot of people that do that, but especially in the more tough areas, they got other things that they're focusing on. How do you think? How do you approach these people to kind of get along with the ride, basically, and
Yeah.
go kind of get with the idea of improving the community and how it'll improve America as a whole? Like, how do you talk to these type of people?
Yeah. So, my career as a facilitator and a coach and a strategist has taken lots of interesting turns. And I've been in situations lots of times where basically I have groups, communities that are fundamentally at odds with each other. That there's the environmentalists on one side and the business interests on the other side, and the community on the other side, and the government on the other side. um, and these conversations get really, really heated. It's not clear that there's any common ground. It's not clear that you're going to come to a solution. I had a professor and mentor actually as a master's student when we were talking about microeconomics. And oftentimes in microeconomics, you talk about market failure, that there's some sort of market and the market failed. And his lesson was that when the market fails, the solution is more market. That there's some aspect that isn't being considered in the market, and so you don't have enough market, so you solve the market problem with more market. I look at these situations very similar, and so when the conversation isn't going right, the solution is more conversation. And so I've applied that in my facilitation, in my workshops, and all of those things, and it applies at the individual level too. So as you mentioned in my introduction, I'm co-founder of this company, Be Act Change, where we do a lot of coaching, we do facilitation, we work with business teams, we work with NGOs to basically help them align and move forward. And our original idea, our original concept behind this business and behind the book that we've written, Creating Your Limitless Life, was really aiming it at Latinos, immigrants, people who we understood to have a commonality of experience with. And the shocking thing, as we've been, growing our business and, selling the book and, touring it, that some of the folks that we have connected with the most and most strongly are exactly this group of folks that you're talking about. Sort of, there's an entire group of, frankly, marginalized white people in the United States who face so many of the same struggles that immigrant communities face, that they don't have that same access to credit, they don't have the generational wealth, they don't necessarily see an infinity of opportunities and the American dream red carpet laid out before them. They see what they see is that they see the day-to-day struggles. They may struggle with poverty, they struggle with healthcare, they struggle with all sorts of things that we don't necessarily typically associate with the white world in the United States. But it's also a fallacy to think that group doesn't exist. And the truth is that once you start talking about the experience, not necessarily as a Latino, but as the experience as you live it, and talking about the struggles, I find that more conversation is always the avenue towards that common ground. So it's sort of a general answer to your question, but what we talk about, what I talk about with my clients in the book and everything else, is that each person brings a unique perspective. We have this whole series of exercises that we go through with our clients, be they individual or corporate or NGOs, about understanding what we call their personal brand, and basically showing how it is that each person has a unique perspective and has a unique approach to problems. And that as a result of that, once you fully account for that, you and I can be in the same sphere, in the same sort of general area, be it personally, professionally, and not necessarily feel competition with each other. And that's a big part of the conversation we have with the population that we didn't think was our original target population. That understanding that there are skills that each person has, that community has, that we don't necessarily, and that we have the opportunity to frankly complement each other. And so that my growth, it's not necessarily a zero-sum game, that my gain is not your loss and your gain is not my loss, and that there's an ability to actually work together and sort of lift both of our ships. And at least that's the experience I've had so far. Some of the conversations initially might be difficult because people have preconceived notions about what you are like as a Latino or what they are like as white people. But that's just because there hasn't been enough conversation. And so the real bridge there is continuing to talk about it, talk about less identity as Latino and white, and talk about more about experience and sort of life and opportunity and emotion, and you'll see that there's so much more commonality and so much more that really unites us than divides us, and that frankly almost everything that I've talked about can apply to those communities as well.
That's definitely very fair. And I could definitely see how people would gravitate towards the experiencing that you're referring to, because a lot of the time, whatever I say in terms of like helping the black community, of course, and things that I've heard in regards to the black community that I agreed and disagreed with in different aspects and avenues in terms of approach towards success from the black community and the perception of other communities, of course, I always try to keep in mind, and I always try to tell people to keep in mind that it is more than your situation. Now, yes, discrimination can definitely occur at different levels when it comes down to success because of, like you said, certain people, certain individuals more specifically, may have preconceived notions and try to deter your path to success in some way, in some fashion. But overall, when it comes down to it, a lot of these individuals that are trying to find success and trying to be greater than they are, a lot of them are facing a lot of similar bumps in the road, regardless of demographic, regardless of identity. And the machine that is America and achieving the American dream, ultimately, when it comes down to the starting opportunities, what we know more so than anything else, that the biggest or the easiest way to achieve success from in terms of this path of starting opportunities is if your family already has wealth. And that is the biggest thing at the end of the day. So when we understand that a lot of these other poor communities are starting from an aspect where their community are potentially very dangerous, potentially filled with things like gang violence or unnecessary crime, potentially over policing, potentially bad public education, unfortunate resources, a lack of tools that you're referring to, such as credit and things like that. You start to realize that yes, we still face different struggles at the end of the day, but a lot of us are still not able to fulfill the dream that we want to because of very, very similar hurdles. So, my last thing for you, and then we'll start wrapping up the show, is once you potentially, or in continuation of trying to solidify the Latino community and find resources for the Latino community, would it be in America's best interest if, can you still hear me? Can you hear me again? Hello, can you hear me?
Now I can hear you. Yeah.
Excellent. Technical difficulties, but I'll continue on my rant. But when it comes down to in the future, when it comes down to these poor communities, that ultimately one of my biggest issues with America right now is dealing with these poor communities filled with the terrible circumstances that I already mentioned, especially considering America in general, I would say, is progressing technology wise. We're progressing in terms of the amount of food we can give people, the medical care, but there's this weird circumstance where why is there more seems to be more violence in these areas? Seems to be the resources are available, but it's harder for these people to get it. So ultimately, my question to you is, do you eventually want to enter another kind of layer of, solidified identity where it's more than Latino, but it's just the people who are suffering in these communities in general and solidifying their identity to achieve that same American dream that you're referring to? Is that a potential ambition that you would, in coinciding with the Latino resource, because that's having a resource for your group, is there's nothing wrong with that, but is that something you considered as well?
I mean, I'm gonna answer you this way. For me, my perspective, my message, this idea of listening to others, advancing your purpose, aligning your actions, living authentically is not something that I necessarily see as for Latinos or for anybody else, but honestly, a movement. You know, I I've worked in international development for a long time. I've worked in countries all over the world. I've worked in high conflict areas where there's active conflict, and I've worked a lot in Haiti, and if you followed the news at all, in terms of what's happening in Haiti in the last couple of years, it's a place that has tremendously lost its governance systems, its safety. People are in tremendous food vulnerability. Over 20% of the population is food insecure in Haiti right now. So there's just a massive humanitarian crisis that's happening. And as you start talking to people all over the world, and including sort of America's inner cities and these much less well-off smaller towns, and areas where we see gun violence and gender-based violence, and you know much more pervasive substance abuse and things like that. As you talk to the folks in those communities anywhere in the world, a big part of what they talk about is their inability to realize their dreams, their inability to move forward with their lives in an authentic way. And it's something that pops up in different ways. Like, if I've walked down sort of Skid Row type areas where you see a lot of young people who are there, young white people who are there, and you don't understand why they're there, and it's because they're LGBTQ, and their families don't accept them, and they don't have a community, and they're not able to live their lives authentically. um, you talk to folks, and a lot of these people, these young men who join gangs in Haiti and are out there committing incredible atrocities. When you talk to leaders the gang leaders in Haiti will tell you that they perfectly well understand that if there was the opportunity for jobs in Haiti, that they would be unable to recruit young men into the gangs. So it's the same thing, right? There's this inability to move forward with what you see as your job in life, your purpose, your dream, your authentic self. And that's something that we're seeing it as a universal phenomenon. So it's not something that I would say is in any way unique to the Latino community. It's something that I talk about it that way because that's the perspective that I see it from. And as you say, I want to see my community prosper, but the United States is my community too. The entire country is my community. And I think of myself as, frankly, a pretty global citizen. So the world is my community, and so I see that creating those conversations, having those conversations openly, not only within what we understand to be our own sociocultural communities, but really taking that conversation and take it on the road, have those conversations with people anywhere you go. I don't see I see a tremendous opportunity there for us to come together in unprecedented ways. You talked about unprecedented levels of division, that we see in our country now, and I certainly am hopeful, because I see, as I said, I see this as a movement. I see that movement as the opportunity to create unprecedented levels of understanding and cooperation that's based on something authentic, something that starts from a commonality of struggle that we share. you know and it's not to talk about. I was thinking earlier in our conversation, you mentioned something about not getting into the debate of who has it worse, who's had it worse, between the Black community and the Latino community and all of that. And I had an interesting opportunity recently to hear uh, Jane Elliott speak. I don't know if you're familiar with Jane Elliott, but she was a teacher, and I think it must have been in the 60s. And she talks about when I apologize if I get it wrong, but if I remember right, her story was about when Martin Luther King was assassinated, and she was a teacher at the time in rural white America, and she did this experiment basically where she made half of the students identify as basically privileged and not privileged, and she did this whole interesting classroom experiment that I think she eventually even got fired for it and all of this. And basically, she didn't do it this way. She didn't call it this, but she made one group black and one group white, and gave one group privilege over the other, and saw how society completely devolved that way, even among small children. But her message, she comes out with the message that she doesn't see color, that there is no color, that there's no such thing as black or brown, and that we're all just shades of brown. And I have to say that I understand her perspective on that, but I also don't fully agree with it. As somebody who grew up brown in America, I see a lot of commonality, and I feel a certain sense of linkage to the African American community, but I also know that to me those experiences are not comparable. I will go out on a limb and say what what I think that the conversation you probably didn't want to have, but to me it's important to continue to distinguish black and brown, Latino, not because those things necessarily have inherent meaning, but because there's history there. There's experiences that cannot be ignored, and that changes how it is that we interact in society and how people are perceived in society. So I think it's a little bit naive to pretend that those differences in history and experience don't exist. From a biological perspective, we can have a whole other conversation, but from a social perspective, those things still have meaning. But as I've said a few times, there's so much more that unites us. There's so much value in having these conversations that focus on this, the commonality of outcomes that we have, our abilities to thrive as individuals, and to have a society of thriving individuals that makes a more cohesive and more democratic, stronger community, state, nation, world.
Very well said. Very well said. Ultimately, a lot of the things that you said has a extraordinary value when it comes down to it, and regardless of what you think in terms of like, especially regarding the history of Black people in America and the current state of affairs and how you think about it, the thing that I'll always continue to preach is that we can always strive for better. There is nothing stopping you, even though your starting point may be different, maybe worse off. There's nothing stopping you for continuously trying to succeed. And something that we have to continue to kind of instill into people, something that you brought up earlier, is continue having that hope of wanting progression, wanting continuation of a better life for not only yourself but for your family and ultimately the community, and ultimately America as a whole, as it strives to be a better nation. Because even when America gets better, the hope as the number one country in the world is that the world will get better as a whole. So it starts from the individual level, and that's how everything starts improving. You can't start it from the top level if your community is not as good as it should be ultimately. So keeping that hope is very powerful, and keeping that hope and continuously having the conversations that you're referring to, opening up your perspective, and trying to be an advocate and pushing certain solutions forward is the key. The local level especially is extremely important, to kind of make better change in your community. So before we start wrapping up, would you like to plug anything? Final words or anything like that?
Yeah, no, more than anything, to thank you for this conversation. As I said, this is a big part of my how and how it is that I go about trying to have that conversation with people. So this opportunity is tremendous, and as I said in the beginning, I really really am thankful for this movement that you're creating as well. I think there's a tremendous value there. You can find us on beactchange.com. We have an Instagram page, which is also b.act.change. You can look me up on LinkedIn. I'm Dr. Paul Rivera. Or you can email me at paul@beactchange.com. I am happy to have this conversation. We do this sort of work with, as I mentioned, with individuals. We work with corporate teams, with NGOs, really helping people find that alignment to their purpose, their mission and vision in the corporate sense. So we do that work. We work globally. We work in multiple languages, so we have lots of opportunity there. And then finally, we have our book, which I've mentioned a couple of times, called Creating Your Limitless Life, which is a little bit of story, give you some perspective on the immigrant experience, and then really a nice step-by-step guide that walks you through all of these things. You can buy paperback, you can buy hardcover, but we've purposely priced the Kindle at 99 cents. And there's an accompanying workbook that is also 99 cents. And we've done that very specifically thinking about, we don't want finances to be a barrier to access to this kind of information that we believe, can really be transformative for the individual. And as you've said, therefore, for families and communities as well. So we wanted to make sure that 99-cent price for the Kindle version made it accessible to anybody who wanted to reach it. So it's out there. Look us up, link with us. Let's keep having that conversation.
All right, appreciate it. You could definitely find all his information in the description, as well as the website on his profile at www.purplepoliticalbreakdown.com. Excellent conversation, very interesting conversation from the perspective of the Latino community. A conversation I've yet to have, but it was a good conversation with all that said. And we'll continue having these conversations and having these solutions without political bias, which is the theme of the podcast, continuously. Started off very strong. Next year should be a very interesting year. Hope you guys enjoyed. Rate it 5 stars. If you want to watch the full episode of this podcast, make sure you go on Roku TV and watch it on the Planet X network, where you can watch the full video version for the podcast. Again, go to Planet X Network on Roku.tv to watch the full version. I hope you do enjoy. Of course, you can still listen to the full audio version on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and any other podcast platform you listen to podcasts.